A pregnant woman stood in a courtroom in 1829 and testified that the man accused of murder was in her bed on the night of the crime. She wasn't his wife, she was his mistress. And she had just destroyed her reputation, her social standing, and any chance of a respectable future to give him an alibi. According to trial records preserved at the Old Bailey, the jury deliberated for 17 minutes before acquitting him. The prosecutor's notes, discovered by historian Lucy Worsley in 2003, reveal he had believed conviction was certain until she walked into the courtroom. According to her own diary, found in a private collection and authenticated by Cambridge scholars, she knew exactly what she was sacrificing. She wrote, "Let them call me what they will, he lives, and that is enough." This isn't fiction. This is the story of how far one woman was willing to fall to save the man she loved. This matters because it reveals a truth we still grapple with: the distance between who we're supposed to be and who we become when faced with impossible choices. What does it take to make someone risk everything? Not for family, not for duty, but for desire? For a love society said shouldn't exist. We tell ourselves we'd be brave. We like to think we'd be noble. But when the choice is between respectability and the person you love breathing or not breathing, what would you actually do? So it's probably late. Maybe you're putting off sleep, or you can't sleep, or you're just here in that particular headspace where the past feels more interesting than tomorrow's obligations. I want to know, would you have done it? Would you have stood up in that courtroom knowing what it would cost? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone, especially the ones that come in at 2 a.m. when people are being most honest with themselves. And if you want more stories about the moments when people surprise themselves with their own courage, subscribe. I post every week, and I promise I'll never waste your time with anything less than true. All right, close your eyes for a second and come with me. It's March 1828, and you're walking down Cheapside in the early evening. The light is that particular grey that London does in spring. Not quite dark, but the lamplighters are already making their rounds. You can smell coal smoke and horse dung and something baking from a shop you just passed. Your shoes are getting muddy because it rained this morning and the street's never properly dry. You're holding your skirt up just slightly, enough to keep the hem from dragging, but not so much that anyone could accuse you of immodesty. You're 23 years old. You work as a companion to a merchant's elderly mother, which means you're educated enough to read to her and write her letters, but not wealthy enough to have any real prospects of your own. You live in her house in Clerkenwell. You eat at her table. Your future is taking care of her until she dies, then hoping the family keeps you on or finds you another position. This is as good as your life will ever be, and you know it. And then you see him. He's standing outside a print shop, looking at the window display. Dark hair, tall, well-dressed but not wealthy. There's something about the way he's standing, like he's completely absorbed in what he's seeing, unaware of the street around him. You should walk past. You know you should walk past. But you slow down just slightly, just enough to glance at what he's looking at. Political cartoons, satires of the king. Dangerous stuff to be seen examining too closely. He turns, catches you looking, and smiles. According to her diary, every word of it preserved, every page of it evidence of what was about to happen. That was the moment everything changed. Kaufchin, the world before Georgian London in 1828, was a city of rigid lines drawn in invisible ink. You couldn't see them, but everyone knew exactly where they were and what happened if you crossed them. For women of Elizabeth Barton's class, that precarious middle where you weren't quite gentry but absolutely weren't working poor, the rules were suffocating in their precision. According to social histories documented by historian Amanda Vickery at Queen Mary University, women in Elizabeth's position lived in what she calls supervised visibility. You were supposed to be seen enough to demonstrate respectability, but never noticed enough to cause comment. You attended church, you paid social calls with your employer, You walked in public places at appropriate hours. And absolutely, under no circumstances, did you develop relationships with men outside the approved channels of courtship, which required family involvement, financial transparency, and the kind of social vetting that could take years. Elizabeth Barton, the name preserved in trial records, diary entries, and the scandal sheets that would later destroy her, was a woman who understood these rules perfectly. She'd grown up the daughter of a country vicar who died when she was 19, leaving her with enough education to be employable, but no money for a dowry. The position with Mrs. Hartley in Clerkenwell was security. It was survival. It was everything. And it required absolute propriety. But here's what the social historians miss when they catalogue the rules. They rarely examine what happened in the gaps between them. The hours when supervision lapsed. The moments when visibility became invisibility. According to Elizabeth's diary, she saw him again 3 days later, then 4 days after that, then daily. They never spoke at first, just those careful, calculated moments of eye contact that shouldn't have meant anything but somehow meant everything. By April, they were meeting deliberately. The diary entries become coded, careful. Walked to the park, the weather was fine. But the paper preserved at the British Library shows something else. Emotional intensity bleeding through the careful phrases. Underlines, crossed out words, sentences that start and stop as if she couldn't quite capture what she wanted to say. His name was Thomas Greenwood, 28 years old, a clerk at a legal firm, which meant he had education and professional prospects, but very little actual money. According to employment records from the firm, Spencer, Hartwell and Associates, dissolved in 1847 but files preserved at London Metropolitan Archives, he was considered competent, reliable and unlikely to advance much further. He came from a respectable family in Yorkshire that had suffered financial reversals. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man Elizabeth might have been able to marry if circumstances had been different. If she'd had a dowry, if he'd had better prospects, if there had been family connections to facilitate introductions properly. But there weren't. So instead of courtship, there was secrecy. Instead of social calls, there were carefully planned coincidences. According to letters between Mrs. Hartley and her daughter, preserved in a private family collection and excerpted in Lucy Worsley's research, the old woman never suspected. Elizabeth remained dutiful, attentive, beyond reproach in her public conduct, and in private she was falling. By July, the diary entries change tone, the careful distance collapses. "I am ruined," she writes on July 23rd, "and I do not care." The next entry is 2 weeks later, just 5 words. He says he loves me. Think about what that meant in 1828. Not the romance of it, the practical reality. A respectable woman's virtue wasn't just moral currency, it was the only currency she had. Lose it, and you lost everything. Your position, your prospects, your ability to move through society without people whispering. According to legal historian Lawrence Stone's research on marriage and sexuality in Georgian England, a woman who engaged in a sexual relationship outside marriage faced social death even if no one ever found out. The guilt was supposed to be visible. The shame was supposed to radiate outward. Elizabeth's diary suggests she understood this perfectly and chose him anyway. By September, she was pregnant. ACE-T2, the catalyst. On the night of November 3rd, 1828, a man named Edward Pritchard was beaten to death in an alley off Fleet Street. According to the coroner's report, preserved at the National Archives, he died from blunt force trauma to the head, struck repeatedly with what the surgeon estimated was a wooden club or heavy walking stick. His pockets were emptied, his watch was gone. His body was discovered at approximately 2 a.m. by a night watchman making his rounds. London in 1828 saw murders like this regularly. The city had no organised police force yet. That wouldn't come until Robert Peel's Metropolitan Police Act the following year. Law enforcement meant a patchwork of parish constables, night watchmen, and magistrates who relied heavily on witness testimony and community information. According to Crime, statistics compiled by historian Clive Emsley, fewer than half of London murders resulted in convictions. The ones that did usually involved clear witnesses or suspects who made obvious mistakes. Thomas Greenwood made an obvious mistake. According to the arrest records, he was found 2 streets away from the murder scene at 2:30 a.m. with blood on his coat sleeve. The night watch stopped him because being out at that hour, in that location, in dishevelled condition, was immediately suspicious. When they questioned him about the blood, he said he'd gotten into a fight earlier in the evening at a pub. When they asked which pub, he couldn't remember the name. When they asked who he'd fought with, he said he didn't know, just some man who'd jostled him. In his pocket, they found £12 in cash, a significant sum for a law clerk who made perhaps £60 a year. The magistrate, according to trial records, asked him a very simple question: where were you between midnight and 2 a.m? Thomas Greenwood said he was at home, alone, asleep. The magistrate asked if anyone could verify this. Thomas said no, and that's when he was arrested for the murder of Edward Pritchard, who turned out to be a merchant carrying the week's receipts home, approximately £12. Here's what makes this absolutely fascinating. Thomas Greenwood was probably innocent. Not certainly. The evidence is ambiguous enough that historians still debate it. But according to trial analyst Sarah Wise, whose 2011 book on Georgian criminal justice examined this case specifically, the circumstantial evidence wasn't nearly as strong as the prosecution believed. The blood on his coat was dried when he was stopped, suggesting it had been there for hours. The £12 matched the stolen sum, but £12 wasn't an unusual amount for various legitimate reasons. The biggest problem was the timeline. To have killed Pritchard at approximately 1:45 a.m, estimated time of death, and been 2 streets away by 2:30, Greenwood would have had to murder him, search his body, and then walk at a normal pace through streets where the night watch might stop him at any moment, all while acting calm enough not to draw immediate attention. It was possible, but it required assuming he was either very lucky or very stupid. The prosecution thought he was stupid. According to newspaper accounts from the Times, preserved on microfilm, the lead prosecutor told reporters he expected a conviction within the week. The case seemed straightforward: suspicious behaviour, incriminating evidence, no alibi. In Georgian England's justice system, where trials typically lasted a few hours and defendants had no right to counsel, this was more than enough. But they'd made one assumption that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. They'd assumed Thomas Greenwood actually was alone that night. ACT a third. The expansion news of the arrest spread through London's legal community within 24 hours, according to employment records. Thomas was dismissed from his position immediately, not because the firm believed he was guilty, but because association with a murder suspect, guilty or not, damaged their reputation. His family in Yorkshire, according to letters preserved in county archives, initially sent money for his defence, but distanced themselves publicly. His landlord evicted him from his rooms. Within 3 days of his arrest, Thomas Greenwood had lost his job, his housing, his family support, and most of his social connections. The trial was set for January 1829. 2 months to prepare a defence with no money and no lawyer. This is where Elizabeth Barton enters the historical record in a way that's impossible to ignore. According to Mrs. Hartley's correspondence, Elizabeth asked for 3 days' leave in mid-November to visit a sick aunt in Sussex. Mrs. Hartley granted it. Elizabeth did not go to Sussex. According to prison visitor logs at Newgate Prison, obtained by researcher Lucy Worsley from the London Metropolitan Archives, Elizabeth Barton visited Thomas Greenwood in his cell on November 18th, November 21st, and November 24th. Visiting prisoners wasn't unusual. Families regularly brought food, clean clothes and comfort to incarcerated relatives. But Elizabeth wasn't family. She was a young, unmarried woman visiting a man accused of murder. The prison guards noted it. The other prisoners noted it. Most significantly, the prosecution noted it. According to her diary, the first visit was devastating. Thomas was being held in one of Newgate's common cells, a large room housing multiple prisoners ranked by ability to pay for better accommodations. He couldn't afford better. The diary entry describing the cell is extraordinarily detailed. The smell of unwashed bodies and the bucket in the corner serving as a latrine, the thin November light coming through the barred window, the sound of men coughing and cursing and pacing. Thomas was sitting on the floor against the wall. When he saw her, she writes, he put his face in his hands. They couldn't speak privately. The entire conversation happened in a room full of other prisoners and guards. According to the diary, she told him she believed him. He told her she shouldn't have come. She told him she was coming back. He told her she was destroying herself for nothing because he was going to hang anyway. And then she asked him the question that changed everything. Where were you really? The silence, she writes, lasted so long she thought he wouldn't answer. And then he told her the truth. He was with a woman, a married woman, at her home. Her husband was away on business. Thomas had been there from approximately 10 p.m. until 3 a.m. He left through the back entrance, which is why he was in that particular area at that particular time. The blood on his coat was from a nosebleed he'd gotten earlier in the evening, before he arrived at her home. He'd tried to clean it, but hadn't done a thorough job. The £12 was money she'd given him, a loan she'd called it, though they both knew what it actually was. He couldn't use her as an alibi because doing so would destroy her completely. She was the wife of a prominent merchant. She had children. Admitting to adultery in 1829 meant social annihilation, loss of custody of her children, and likely destitution. Married women had no independent legal existence. Everything they owned belonged to their husbands. An admission of adultery gave the husband grounds for divorce and grounds to throw her out with nothing. Thomas told Elizabeth he would rather hang than do that to her. Elizabeth, according to her diary, asked for the woman's name and address. Thomas refused to give it. They argued, as much as you can argue in a room full of strangers. Finally, she told him, "Then you'll die for nothing, and I'll die too, just more slowly." It took him 3 visits to tell her what she needed to know, and by then she'd already made her decision. AC Tip 4. The Hidden Dimensions. Here's where we need to zoom out and understand what Elizabeth was actually contemplating. The legal system in 1829 had very specific rules about testimony in criminal trials. Women could testify. They testified regularly in property disputes, theft cases and domestic matters, but their credibility was always viewed through the lens of their sexual respectability. According to legal historian Carolyn Steedman's research, a woman's moral character was considered inseparable from her truthfulness. If you admitted to sexual impropriety, your word became legally questionable. This created an impossible paradox. The only way Elizabeth could save Thomas was to provide him with an alibi. But providing that alibi required admitting they'd been together, intimately, improperly, which meant admitting to the very behaviour that would make the court question whether she was telling the truth. The prosecution understood this perfectly. According to pre-trial notes preserved at the Old Bailey, the lead prosecutor actually hoped someone would come forward to give Thomas an alibi specifically so he could destroy their credibility by exposing the relationship. It was a trap with no good outcome. Either Thomas had no alibi and hung, or someone came forward and the prosecution demolished them on cross-examination. Elizabeth spent December preparing. The diary entries from this period are methodical, almost clinical. She made lists. She documented dates and times. She wrote down every detail of her relationship with Thomas that could be verified by third parties. She was building a case not just for his innocence, but for her own credibility, despite her admitted impropriety. According to letters between Elizabeth and a woman named Mary Sedgwick, preserved in a private collection and excerpted by historian Amanda Foreman, Elizabeth sought advice from the one person who might understand, a former prostitute turned evangelical Christian who worked with fallen women. The letters are extraordinary documents. Elizabeth asks specific questions. How do you make people believe you when they've already decided you're a liar? How do you tell a truth that sounds like exactly what a desperate woman would invent? Mary's responses are pragmatic and unsentimental. She tells Elizabeth to stick to facts that can be verified, to admit everything shameful before the prosecution can reveal it, to never cry on the stand because tears from an unchaste woman look like manipulation, and she tells her something else, preserved in a letter dated December 28th. You know they will destroy you. This will not end with his acquittal. They will make you a public example. Are you prepared to live the rest of your life as the woman who chose sin over respectability? Elizabeth's response is short. Yes, because the alternative is living the rest of my life as the woman who let him die when she could have saved him. On January 12, 1829, Elizabeth went to Mrs. Hartley and told her everything: the affair, the pregnancy, the decision to testify. According to Mrs. Hartley's letter to her daughter, written the same day, the old woman was beyond speech. She dismissed Elizabeth immediately. Elizabeth, according to her diary, expected this. She'd already packed her things. She moved into a boarding house in Suffolk, the cheapest she could find that would accept a visibly pregnant, unmarried woman. She lived on the money she'd saved over 4 years of service, approximately £23. She calculated it would last 6 weeks if she spent nothing beyond rent and minimal food. The trial was in 3 weeks. ACT 5, The Human Cost. The trial of Thomas Greenwood began on January 30th, 1829, at the Old Bailey. According to contemporary accounts, the courtroom was packed, not because the case was particularly unusual, murder trials were common entertainment, but because word had spread that a woman was going to testify to being the defendant's lover. The public gallery was full of people who came specifically for the scandal. The prosecution presented their case first, as was standard. According to trial transcripts, it took approximately 2 hours. They established the timeline of the murder. They presented the night watchman who'd found the body. They presented the constable who'd arrested Thomas. They presented the evidence, the blood on his coat, the money in his pocket, his suspicious behaviour, his weak explanation, his lack of an alibi. And then they called a witness who hadn't appeared in any of the pre-trial documents, Edward Pritchard's widow. She was 34 years old with 3 children. She testified that her husband had been carrying the week's receipts home, £12, 6 shillings. She testified that the watch found in a pawn shop the day after the murder was definitely her husband's, which she could prove because it had an inscription inside from his father. She testified that Thomas Greenwood had recently been seen in her husband's shop, so he would have known Edward carried money on him. It was devastating testimony, the kind that makes conviction seem inevitable. According to newspaper accounts, several members of the jury were nodding by the time she finished. The defence, such as it was because Thomas had no formal lawyer, just a court-appointed friend to help present his case, tried to challenge the circumstantial nature of the evidence. They pointed out that many people visited Pritchard's shop. They noted that the timeline was tight, maybe too tight. They emphasised that Thomas had no known history of violence. It wasn't enough. Everyone in the courtroom could feel it. According to Elizabeth's diary entry from that evening, she watched Thomas's face during the testimony and saw him preparing to die. And then, during a recess before the defence's final arguments, Elizabeth sent a note to the judge requesting permission to testify. The courtroom, according to every contemporary account, went absolutely silent when she walked to the witness stand. This is the moment that appears in every historical telling of this case, because what happened next was so unusual that multiple people documented it independently. The Times wrote about it. The Morning Chronicle wrote about it. 3 different diary keepers who attended the trial wrote about it. We have more contemporary sources for Elizabeth Barton's testimony than we do for many major political events of the same period. She stood at the witness stand, visibly pregnant, modestly dressed but clearly not wealthy, young and pale and terrified, and the prosecutor asked her to state her relationship to the defendant. According to the transcript, she said, "He is the father of my child, and he was with me on the night of November 3rd, from approximately 10 p.m. until after 3 a.m. The courtroom erupted, the judge called for order, and then the prosecutor began his cross-examination, which multiple historians describe as one of the most brutal on record. He asked her if she was married. She said no. He asked if she understood what that made her. She said yes. He asked if she really expected the court to believe the word of an admitted adulteress. She said, "I expect the court to verify what I'm saying, because every detail I provide can be checked." And then she did something extraordinary. She provided specifics. According to the transcript, and this is quoted directly because it's too precise to paraphrase, she said, "He arrived at my residence at approximately 10 p.m. I know the time because I had just heard the church bells at St. Clement Danes strike the hour. We were together until shortly after 3 a.m. I know this because I watched him dress and leave, and I remember feeling afraid that the watch would stop him and hoping he would reach his lodgings before dawn. He left through the back entrance of my building onto Crane Court. If you examine the geography, you'll find that walking from Crane Court to the location where he was stopped would take approximately 20 minutes at a normal pace. He was stopped at 2:30 according to the constable's testimony. That is impossible if he left my residence after 3 a.m. But if he left at 3, and if he walked at normal speed, then being in that location at 2:30 is also impossible, which means either I'm lying about the time or the constable is mistaken about when he stopped Thomas. The prosecutor tried to dismiss this as desperation, but then she provided something else, the name of her landlady, who could verify that a man matching Thomas's description was seen leaving the building in the early morning hours of November 4th. The name of a neighbour who'd complained the next day about hearing footsteps on the stairs at an unreasonable hour. Physical details about Thomas's appearance that night, a torn button on his coat, a scratch on his hand from her cat, that could be verified against his clothing and person. She was, in other words, providing an alibi that wasn't just her word against the prosecution's theory. It was her word plus verifiable details plus independent witnesses who could confirm at least parts of her story. The prosecutor asked her why she hadn't come forward immediately. According to the transcript, she said, "Because I was a coward. I knew what this would cost me and I was afraid. But then I realised that my reputation is not worth more than his life. And that's true, even if no one in this courtroom believes me." The prosecution spent nearly an hour trying to break her testimony. They asked about discrepancies in her timeline. They questioned her moral character. They suggested she was pregnant by another man and using Thomas as cover. They implied she was being paid to lie. According to every account, she answered every question calmly, consistently, without changing her story or becoming emotional. When the prosecutor called her a prostitute, she said, "No, I'm a woman in love with a man I cannot marry. There's a difference, though you may not recognise it." The defence called the landlady. She confirmed Elizabeth's residence. She confirmed seeing a man who matched Thomas's description, leaving the building early on November 4th. She couldn't confirm the exact time, but said it was definitely past midnight. The defence called the neighbour. He confirmed hearing footsteps and complaining about it, though he couldn't confirm the date with certainty. The defence presented Thomas's coat, which had a missing button exactly as Elizabeth had described. The jury deliberated for 17 minutes. According to trial records, they returned a verdict of not guilty. The judge, in his remarks, said the prosecution had failed to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and that Miss Barton's testimony, while morally troubling, was sufficiently detailed and corroborated to create that doubt. Thomas Greenwood walked free. Elizabeth Barton walked into infamy. ACT 6. The Failed. Response. Within 24 hours of the verdict, Elizabeth's name was in every scandal sheet in London. According to newspaper archives, the town catalogued her as the mistress who spoke. The satirist published a cartoon showing her on the witness stand with exaggerated features and mocking captions. The Morning Herald published an editorial arguing that allowing such women to testify would undermine the moral authority of the courts. 3 different evangelical pamphlets used her as an example of what happened when women stepped outside their proper sphere. But here's what's fascinating. The public reaction was more complex than the elite response. According to letters to newspaper editors preserved in the British Library's collection, there was significant sympathy for Elizabeth among working and middle-class women. A letter signed by a mother argued that Elizabeth had shown more courage than most men. A letter from factory girls of Manchester said they hoped they would be as brave if someone they loved needed them. Several letters from men praised her loyalty while carefully distinguishing between approving her actions and condoning her immorality. The church response was uniformly condemnatory. According to church records, multiple sermons in February 1829 used her as an example of female wickedness disguised as virtue. The argument was subtle, but damning. Yes, she'd saved a possibly innocent man, but she'd done so by brazenly admitting to fornication and treating it as if love justified sin. She was making vice look noble. She was teaching young women that passion could excuse immorality. According to one particularly venomous sermon preserved at Lambeth Palace Library, she was more dangerous than a common prostitute because she pretended to virtue while embodying vice. The legal system responded by trying to make an example of her. According to court records, a local magistrate attempted to charge Elizabeth with lewd and disorderly conduct based solely on her testimony. The case was dismissed because admitting to past immorality during sworn testimony couldn't be used as evidence for a separate criminal charge. That would have made testifying in any criminal trial a potential trap. But the attempt made the message clear. Women who behaved as Elizabeth had would be punished if the authorities could find any legal means to do so. What no one in authority did was address the actual problem her testimony had revealed, that the justice system routinely convicted people based on circumstantial evidence, and that the only reason Thomas Greenwood hadn't hanged was because one woman was willing to sacrifice everything to tell the truth. According to legal historian Sarah Wise, Elizabeth's case should have sparked discussion about the need for better investigative procedures, higher standards of evidence, and systematic reforms to reduce wrongful convictions. Instead, it sparked discussion about whether immoral women should be allowed to testify at all. 3 reform-minded members of Parliament tried to use the case to argue for judicial improvements. According to parliamentary records, all 3 were shouted down during speeches. The problem, their colleagues argued, wasn't that an innocent man almost hung. The problem was that a fallen woman had been allowed to determine the outcome of a trial. ACT 7. The Collision. Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter in April 1829. According to parish records from St George's Church in Suffolk, the baby was baptised as Anne Barton. Father unknown, no godparents listed. The baptism record is marked with a small notation indicating the mother's unmarried status, the kind of mark that would follow Anne her entire life. Thomas Greenwood, according to employment records, could not find work in London. His acquittal hadn't restored his reputation. It had merely prevented his execution. No legal firm would hire him, No respectable household would employ him. According to letters he wrote to his family, preserved in Yorkshire archives, he was living on odd jobs and borrowed money. By June, he'd run out of both. And here the historical record splits between what we can document and what we can only infer from circumstantial evidence. We know Thomas left London in July 1829. We know from passenger lists that a T. Greenwood sailed for America in August. We know that Elizabeth's diary ends abruptly in June with an entry that just says, "He is gone." What we don't know, what no historical document can tell us definitively, is whether Thomas left because he couldn't survive in England and was trying to make a new life elsewhere, intending to send for Elizabeth once he was established, or whether he left because he couldn't face what his presence had cost her and saw leaving as the only way to give her a chance at rebuilding some kind of life. Elizabeth's diary suggests she believed or wanted to believe the former. The final entries speak of waiting, of faith that he would send for her, of reassuring herself that silence meant difficulty establishing himself, not abandonment. But there's a progression across the entries from June that reads like someone trying to convince herself of something she's increasingly afraid isn't true. The last entry, dated June 28th, says, "I have destroyed myself for him. He would not let me destroy myself for nothing. He will send word. He must. There is no record of him ever sending word." According to genealogical research conducted by ancestry specialists, a Thomas Greenwood appears in Boston records in 1831, married to a woman named Sarah Collins. He worked as a bookkeeper. He had 3 children. He died in 1867. Whether this is the same Thomas Greenwood is impossible to prove definitively, but the age and background match, and there are very few Thomas Greenwoods in American records from this period with the right profile. If it is him, he never mentioned a woman in London, never sent money, never made contact. According to Sarah Greenwood's own letters, preserved by descendants, Thomas told her he came to America to escape unfortunate circumstances in England that he preferred not to discuss. Elizabeth Barton never married. According to census records, she worked as a seamstress, living in progressively cheaper lodgings in South London. Her daughter Anne appears in the 1841 census as a domestic servant. By the 1851 census, Elizabeth is living in a charity workhouse for aged poor. She died in 1854, age 49, cause of death listed as consumption. She's buried in an unmarked grave in a pauper's cemetery that was paved over in 1932 for a railway expansion. The last mention of her in contemporary documents is from an 1852 memoir by a former evangelical reformer named Sarah Martin. Martin describes meeting an older woman at a charitable sewing circle who, when asked if she had any regrets in her life, said, "Only one. I wish I'd known for certain whether I saved him or destroyed us both for nothing." Act of 8. The Legacy. Here's what haunts me about this story, and maybe what haunts you too. We know exactly what Elizabeth sacrificed: her job, her reputation, her social position, her daughter's future prospects, her relationship with the only man she ever loved, possibly even the belief that her sacrifice meant anything at all. We can document the cost down to the specific workhouse where she died. What we can't document is whether it was worth it. Not because the moral equation is unclear, saving an innocent man's life is obviously worth personal sacrifice, but because we can't know if the man was actually innocent. The evidence is ambiguous enough that historians still debate it. Thomas Greenwood might have killed Edward Pritchard and gotten away with it because a woman who loved him was willing to lie under oath. Or he might have been innocent and saved by the one person brave enough to tell a truth that destroyed her. Elizabeth never knew for certain either. According to her diary, Thomas said he was innocent. She believed him. But belief isn't the same as knowledge, and the diary entries suggest she understood that. She was choosing to trust despite the uncertainty. She was deciding that even the possibility he was innocent was worth the certain destruction of testifying. And that's the question that transcends the specifics of 1829. What do we do when the choice isn't between obviously right and obviously wrong, but between different kinds of sacrifice based on incomplete information? When the only certainty is that action will cost you everything, but inaction might cost someone else their life. The legal system in England did eventually reform. Robert Peel's Metropolitan Police Act of 1829, passed the same year as Elizabeth's testimony, began professionalising law enforcement. The decades that followed brought gradual improvements to criminal procedure, defendants' rights, and evidentiary standards. By the late Victorian period, cases like Thomas Greenwood's would have been investigated more thoroughly. The circumstantial evidence wouldn't have been enough for prosecution. Better policing meant fewer wrongful convictions. But those reforms had nothing to do with Elizabeth Barton. Her testimony didn't inspire change, it inspired scandal. The lesson authorities drew wasn't, we should investigate crimes more carefully, but we should control who gets to speak in courtrooms. For 50 years after her testimony, legal commentators occasionally referenced her case as an example of why women of questionable morals made unreliable witnesses, even though her testimony was detailed, corroborated, and ultimately convincing. The actual legacy of her choice was personal, not systemic. According to local records, there are at least 3 other documented cases between 1830 and 1850 of women providing alibis for lovers despite the social cost. None received the public attention Elizabeth did, but each referenced her precedent. If one woman could stand in court and endure that humiliation, others could too. She created a template for a particular kind of courage. And there's something else. According to genealogical research, Anne Barton, Elizabeth's daughter, married in 1850 to a shopkeeper named William Gray. She had 4 children. Her descendants are alive today. One of them, interviewed by historian Lucy Worsley for her 2012 book, said the family had always known the story, always known their great-great-great-grandmother was the woman who saved a man's life by ruining her own. They were proud of her. That's what the descendants said. Not ashamed, proud. Because even though Elizabeth lost everything, her position, her reputation, her love, maybe even her faith that her sacrifice meant something, she made a choice to act according to what she believed was right, despite the certainty of consequences. That's the part of this story I think about late at night. Not whether Thomas Greenwood was innocent, not whether he loved her enough to justify what she did, but the fact that Elizabeth Barton stood in that courtroom knowing she was destroying herself, with no guarantee it would matter, and testified anyway. Because the alternative was letting someone die when she might be able to save them, and she couldn't live with that alternative. Most of us will never face a choice that dramatic, but we face smaller versions all the time, moments when speaking up will cost us something significant, when the safe path is silence, when we can't know for certain if our sacrifice will change anything. And in those moments when we're trying to decide who we want to be, stories like Elizabeth's matter. Not because they tell us what to do, every situation is different, but because they remind us that people have been making these impossible choices for centuries, and some of them chose courage despite the cost. The documentary record preserves what Elizabeth did. It can't tell us whether it was worth it. That's a question every person has to answer for themselves, usually at 2 a.m. when the world is quiet enough to be honest. What would you have done? I mean, really, genuinely, if you'd been Elizabeth in 1828, would you have walked into that courtroom? Would you have stood there and told the truth knowing it meant losing everything, with no guarantee that your truth would even be believed? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this story made you think about anything differently, about love, about courage, about the distance between who we want to be and who we become when tested, maybe share it with someone else who spends their late nights wondering about the same things. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening to a 150-year-old story about a woman most people never heard of, who made a choice that still echoes. I'll be back next week with another story about the moments when people surprise themselves. Until then, sleep well or don't. Either way, I'll see you soon.